Good evening. Welcome to Talk Ottawa. We're going to talk about tasers tonight and whether the Ottawa Police Service should adopt more of them and give them to frontline officers. Right now, they're carried by more senior personnel. We're going to explore that issue because the province has cleared the way for that to happen, but each individual police service in Ontario has to make its own decision on that. So the Ottawa Police Service is consulting right now and will be making a decision in the months ahead. There are many implications to this, including budget implications, and we're going to start our discussion tonight with Superintendent Uday Jaswal of the Ottawa Police Service. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Great to see you again. And so let's talk about what's happening right now, and then we'll talk about what might happen in the future. The Ottawa Police Service does have tasers, but only certain people are allowed to use them. Is that right?
Correct. So the guidelines, before we received the current revised guidelines, allowed frontline supervisors and members of a tactical unit to carry them. So that's the way they're deployed currently within the Ottawa Police Service. And for what that means for us on a day-to-day basis is we could have as few as 5 conducted energy weapons on the road, up to about 15 conducted energy weapons on the road at any one time. So it's about the availability and access to that technology when it's required and appropriate.
And so when I hear that, we can have the whole debate about whether or not police should have tasers at all, but it strikes me that if you're going to have them, it's sort of awkward to have only some people having them, because how do you know who's got the taser and who's got the situation that requires the taser? Those two things might not match up, and you might need one on short notice, right?
Absolutely. So I mean, that's where the for them to be a benefit to the public in terms of improving public safety, a benefit to our members in terms of having the right tools available to do the job. You're absolutely right. They need to be deployed in a way that makes sense given our current model. And there are some restrictions based on the old guidelines, certainly, in terms of doing that well. So that's part of the discussion that we want to have with the community right now is how do we look at future deployment options for the police service, considering all the different concerns that we have heard already from not only from stakeholders but the community at large.
All right, so let's talk about when a taser should and shouldn't be used. What are the circumstances under which you would use a stun gun?
So under the Ontario use of force model, which is something that's taught and instructed to all police officers, it's considered an intermediate weapon. And it can be used when the behavior of the individual is considered to be assaultive, or when the totality of the circumstances would suggest that it's an appropriate tool. So, for example, if we're dealing with someone who's suicidal and as a option other than potentially lethal force in terms of a firearm, we may consider a taser. So the parameters are fairly specific in terms of when they can be used, and certainly as a police service we would expect our members to use the appropriate level of force, use the appropriate type of force option if that were required. I think what's important to remember whenever we're talking about use of force and force options, though, is to keep in mind that the vast majority of incidents that we deal with are resolved successfully through the officer's presence, through their use of communication skills, through their ability to de-escalate those situations. So in the vast majority of cases, we never have to use any force. And I think that's the testament to the professionalism of our members.
Is it oversimplifying things to say that that the taser can be sort of inserted as a tool that can be used before using a weapon like a gun, so that in a circumstance where you might otherwise have to shoot somebody, you could use the taser instead, and it could actually be a less lethal form of force?
So the taser, it's important that we recognize taser doesn't replace a firearm or lethal force. There are circumstances when a firearm as a response is appropriate and, and needs to be used by an officer. But in cases, for example, with the tactical unit, when they have the options of multiple types of use of force options, or even if we see further deployment conducted energy weapons at our patrol level, where a number of options can be brought to the scene, then potentially you could utilize conducted energy weapon in lieu of lethal force initially, or using a firearm. So that does provide that option. In fact, we've seen that a number of times, not only in the city of Ottawa with our experience with conducted energy weapons, but elsewhere in the province, where in fact that very scenario has played out, that we have been able to diffuse this scenario, bring it to a successful conclusion through the use of a conducted energy weapon.
Where if there hadn't been one, perhaps somebody would have had to use a firearm.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
So let me ask us from a different perspective then, are tasers safe? Because although obviously they are meant to disable somebody, they're not meant to cause any lasting harm to an individual, and yet there have been cases where people have suffered serious consequences, including some people who died after being tasered.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're right. They're meant to be a non-lethal option for us. What I can tell you is that the ministry, prior to providing us with the revised guidelines, actually held a bit of an expert panel, and they did consult with the medical community. They did speak to civil liberties organizations, other key community stakeholders, and they made the decision that it was prudent to go ahead with an expanded deployment. We can look at some other reports that have come out recently, the Canadian Council of Academies, that speaks to the fact that conducted energy weapons pose a low risk of serious injury. We can go to BC and the Braidwood Inquiry, which says that on the balance, conducted energy weapons are a good tool, but it does speak to the accountability and governance that needs to be placed around the use of conducted energy weapons. And again, as a police service, we're certainly very interested in making sure that we have the right accountability and governance around their use.
What about the risk that when you give somebody a new tool, they're going to use it, and in some cases they might use it in a circumstance where they ought not to? That's the concern I think a lot of people have, and it's something that that happens all the time. To give a parallel example, people who have automatic braking systems in their cars might rely on them too much instead of only in an emergency, so it creates a bit of a complacency. There are people who are concerned that if you give every police officer a taser, that they're going to pull them out sometimes when maybe they shouldn't.
Sure. So, I mean, I think what we're speaking to, again, is the accountability and governance around that. We would certainly expect that our officers are well-trained, and yet they're responsible and accountable for the decisions and their actions. And so that they're choosing the appropriate force response if that's required in a particular situation. Not to mention the fact that again, there's a number of oversight mechanisms as well within the policing system that would help monitor that. So the taser is, in fact, by its design, the most accountable use of force option we have.
Okay, we're going to talk more about the budget implications of this. We're also going to talk to someone from the Ontario Civil Liberties Association, and we'll talk to a Carleton University criminology professor who has some specific thoughts on whether or not police officers should have tasers. We'll be right back on Talk Ottawa. Welcome back to Talk Ottawa. We're talking about tasers and whether or not frontline officers in the Ottawa Police Service should be allowed to use them. The police service is consulting with the public on that now. And just before we talk more about the implications of that, let's talk about, from a safety point of view and from a policy point of view, let's talk about the budget implications.
Sure.
So each unit is pretty expensive, isn't it?
That's right. They're about $2,000. Including the battery and cartridges that would be required to operate it, as well, factor in the training that's associated with that as well. So they're a significant investment. So
if, I believe you have about 200 of them now?
We have about 200.
So if you wanted to get another 200 to equip more people, then that's a cost of $400,000.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So there's no definitive plans in place yet around equipping any number of officers at this point. I think what we're sincerely doing is really consulting with the community around making some recommendations to the board around deployment, an optimal deployment for us within the City of Ottawa.
And I get the sense that based on your budget, you wouldn't be able to just flip a switch and give every police officer a taser overnight, right?
No, and I don't think that would be our intention either. I think we would want to be quite thoughtful in the way that we implemented additional conducted energy weapons into our frontline deployment. I think we'd want to have an opportunity to evaluate how that implementation goes and to make sure that we have the right set of accountability and governance standards around that as well. So I think it would be a phased-in multi-year approach that we'd be looking at.
All right, let's talk to Daryl Davies, who is a criminology professor at Carleton University. He's on the line. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
So what's your thought on this? I get the sense from what you've said before that you're opposed to the police having more tasers.
Well, it's not a question of, that I'm opposed to police having more tasers. I guess the question is that when the Ontario Ministry of Community and Correctional Services announced back in 2013, that they would change the guidelines, associated with the use of conducted energy weapons, the question that popped in my mind immediately was, what was the rationale for that? What was that based on? Who did they consult with? And more importantly, why have they left it up to each individual police jurisdiction to do some sort of consultation process after the fact? So I think they dropped the ball on that in a big way, that is, the ministry did, by not, undertaking a study initially on basically use of force as it presently exists now to see, A, whether it's adequate, whether, B, it should be expanded. And so there's a whole series of questions that they never asked. And they've given agencies like the Ottawa Police, Windsor, Niagara, all of them, sort of doing their own thing. And I think instead of having uniform guidelines that are absolutely crystal clear, and the rationale as to why they wanted to expand the use of tasers at the street level, at the, we'll say, police officer level on the street, has never been made clear to the public. And so I think this is a huge problem. It's left police agencies like Ottawa forced to do the consultation process as part of their planning process, when this should have been done not by police, but rather by the Ontario Ministry of Public Safety and Correctional Services.
So you're concerned about the process, but are you also concerned about the devices themselves?
Well, the way I see it, Mark, is that the taser is one element of a large package of what we call use of force. And as the public wouldn't know this, but police certainly do, that there is a national use of force model, a continuum, which expands, basically from the less serious to the more serious, from verbal commands to, to grips right up to, lethal use of force. And in my opinion, at least, looking at the taser, it's only one element. But if you ask people, well, even politicians, where does the taser fit in this national use of force model, or in the case of the province of Ontario, the Ontario use of force model, I suspect most police officers and even politicians wouldn't be able to tell you with any degree of specificity. So there's this nebulous gray area. And, can we actually say that we're comfortable just adding another, another tool to the kit? Is it needed? Is it required? Is there empirical evidence that what we have available, police have available at their, in their toolkit now is inadequate? And if so, show me the proof, because we don't have that.
Now, I read a story in which you were quoted as saying something to the effect of, the more toys we give to police officers, the less communication skills they have, the less effective they are dealing with these situations through interpersonal skills. So it sounds there like you're concerned that it'll become a tool of convenience for them that they're going to use in situations where perhaps it isn't warranted. Is that your concern?
Well, that's it. Technology is a great thing, Mark. It's wonderful. But when people no longer talk to each other, we're no longer using our verbal skills to speak to each other. It's a huge handicap. And look at the RCMP officers in the Dachansky case just for a minute. Here you have 4 police officers, including a supervisor, who know or should have known what the policy was under the RCMP Act with respect to deployment of tasers. And yet, on the video that that was widely circulated, you can actually see the 3 of them coming down. The one officer turns to the supervisor and says, can I use the taser? And he says yes. That's before they even got to the area before they could even do a threat assessment, before they even saw the circumstances for what they were, a decision had already been made, clearly contrary to RCMP policy.
But if somebody contravenes a policy, is that an issue of the individual, or is it an issue of the tool? Because
it's an issue of training, and it goes back to my point that I personally feel training is completely inadequate in the province, and this is an area that needs to be focused on. So the use of force model has to look at the training. It has to look at, what we have now. Can we justify simply adding a very expensive, I might add, element to this use of force model unless we can show demonstrably that we need it?
But if somebody uses a gun when they shouldn't use a gun in the line of police work, or uses their baton when they shouldn't use their baton, that's an issue of the individual, and obviously there might be some disciplinary measures or even charges that could apply in some circumstances, but nobody would then say, well, let's take away all the batons or let's take away all the firearms that the police have.
But if you're clearly faced with a situation where it's happening on a frequent basis, throughout the province, throughout the country, then there's something fundamentally wrong. Either police know what the policy is and are ignoring it, or B, don't know the policy. And we know from research, for example, that, and this has been true not just in Canada but in the U.S., that when you do not have clearly defined, well-articulated, and well-trained police officers with respect to the policies and procedures, it does have a significant impact on the way use of force is used, whether it's used at all.
So are you saying there have been frequent instances in Ontario where the taser has been used inappropriately?
Well, not so much I can think of an incident that was reported a year ago where even at an OPP detachment, two officers got into a verbal conflict and one pulled a taser on the other. All I'm saying to you is that what we should be focusing on is de-escalation. We should be looking at how we can de-escalate force in police-citizen encounters, under what circumstances, what are the risk factors involved, are they clear, do we actually know what they are, when are we going to be in a position, therefore, to say, okay, this option is better than a second option? I mean, at what point, down the road do we wait? Was it appropriate to taser Sammy Yatim, for example, after he was shot 9 times? I think the public want answers to those questions. I think we deserve answers to those questions. And I think now what's happening is people are demanding answers. But I think the Ministry of Public Safety and Correctional Services has not addressed this issue in a logical way. They've sort of dumped the ball on the police. And all I'm saying, I'm not against the use of taser. If there's evidence that that street cops need tasers, then show it to me. Give me the empirical evidence so that the public can see, yes, there's a need for it.
Okay. We'll have to stop there, but Daryl Davies, I appreciate your time today. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me, Mark.
Carleton University criminologist Daryl Davies. We'll get some reaction from the Ottawa Police to some of those comments, and we'll talk to the Ontario Civil Liberties Association as well about the use of tasers by frontline officers in Ottawa when we return on Talk Ottawa. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Talk Ottawa. Should frontline police officers in the Ottawa Police Service have tasers? And that's our question this evening, and we're talking to a number of different guests about that. Let's get some reaction from you, Superintendent Jaswal, on our last guest, Daryl Davies, what he was saying. Some of it was about the process, and I think there are, whatever the process is, we are where we are, and the police are doing a consultation now, but he was raising concerns about how the tasers are actually used.
Sure. I mean, I think one thing I'd certainly take issue with in terms of the comments of Professor Davies is that police officers don't know the use of force continuum if they don't receive training in that. I think every police officer is aware of the use of force continuum. It's part of our annual requalification. They do know that conductive energy weapons fall within the intermediate category and what that means in terms of the behaviors that they need to be facing in order to choose to use that type of force option. But I mean, I think he makes a good point around training, and I think that certainly as a police organization, we also want to equip our members to do the job well and to do the job well on behalf of the public. We're one of the first services, we are the first service in Ontario that's actually initiated some communication de-escalation training, which began in January, which is based on some of the findings out of British Columbia, specifically out of the Braidwood inquiry. So we are trying to address some of those concerns through that type of training, and really the training is about reinforcing the skills that police officers are using effectively every day in terms of the work that they do. Again, I will also say in response to Professor Davies that you know, certainly there have been instances where we can certainly question the appropriateness of force on behalf of an officer, and there's mechanisms to do that. There's accountability within the system to do that. Unfortunately, there have been some tragic circumstances as well, and I think it's important that that those mechanisms of accountability are robust. But I also think that again, we need to highlight that the majority of instances that police officers engage with,
we hear about the ones that are
absolutely
that are exceptional.
And I think that falls on the police service, and the fact that we don't communicate that as effectively in terms of the successes we have around communication de-escalation.
Okay, I want to bring on our next guest, who is Joseph Hickey, the Executive Director of the Ontario Civil Liberties Association. Thank you for joining us.
Hello there.
So what do you think about this? Should frontline officers in Ottawa, in Ontario, be using tasers?
Well, our position with the Ontario Civil Liberties Association is that the focus should not be on tasers, but on deeper problems that need deeper examination. And to roll back the chronology, the Ontario government's decision to allow more tasers, more officers to carry tasers, came in direct reaction to the shooting of Sami Yatim in Toronto last summer. So that's the context for this. It was a horrific event that was captured on video, and everyone who saw that was shocked. And no one who sees that video is going to say, oh, if only the officers had tasers. What they say is, how on earth could this happen in Canada? What is going on here that this could happen? And why are these officers acting that way? So putting more weapons on the street is not the right response to an incident like that. Rather, it's not about technology, but it's about the police as an institution. It's about the training, the culture, and the role that the police have in the community. And so the Ottawa police could take the lead here, and they could stand up and say, rather than a bunch of new weapons, we're going to admit there's something systemically wrong with policing in the province, and we're going to take the position to openly search for and examine the root causes here. And
So
we're going to involve the community.
let me jump in here just because we're short on time, but when you say, because of the Sami Yatim incident in Toronto, why is that an issue? How can we jump from there to saying there's a widespread problem with police in the province?
Well, first of all, I want to clarify that the government's announcement of the new permissions to allow more officers to carry tasers was in direct reaction to that shooting. And it's an example that is just so extreme, and it's so clear to everyone who sees that there must be something wrong here. It doesn't look like Canada, but yet it is.
Okay, but we're not having we could have a discussion, but we're not having a discussion on the Sami Yatim incident. And even if that incident was completely wrong, and even if it's wrong for the province to introduce tasers in response to that incident, if that's what's happening here, that doesn't mean tasers are wrong on their own. They might actually be a useful tool for police officers.
Right, but my point is that the focus shouldn't be on introducing new weapons. It should be on the systemic problems that are real, that do exist, and that need a real deep examination. There's a movement of the police away from being members of the community, mediators, and toward a more militaristic role.
Okay.
And people are afraid of the police, and so there are a lot of examples that show that there are systemic problems with training.
Okay, we'll have to stop there, but thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Okay, thank you.
We don't have a lot of time left, but I wanted to get your reaction to that. What do you think about what he was saying about there being this more widespread problem that the police are less involved in the community and so on? That isn't my experience in Ottawa, but
and I would say that's certainly not my experience either. I think one of the great facets of being a police officer in Ottawa is our proximity, closeness to the community, and our ability to discuss these types of sensitive issues with them. But just one thing I would say in terms of clarification is that they're not new weapons. Tasers and conducted energy weapons have been in existence for 40 years. We've used them successfully and effectively in Ottawa since 2000. We've never experienced any serious injury as a result of their use. In fact, we've seen them save lives. We've seen them increase public safety. And what we're talking about is improving our access to that option when it's appropriate for officers to use.
Right. Okay, we'll have to stop there. Very quickly, though, what's the timeline on making a recommendation to the Police Services Board?
So we're hoping to provide some recommendations to the board in April.
Okay, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll see you again next time on Talk Ottawa. Good night.